My name is Ethan Blackwood. I'm 34, and I've spent the last decade building a quiet but successful photography career in the foothills of Vermont. Not the kind of success my in-laws recognize, especially Loretta, my mother-in-law. To her, success wears cufflinks, not a camera strap. So when she handed me a drink at her birthday dinner last Friday, smiling too wide and saying, "A special spritz for my favorite son-in-law," I felt something shift. I took the glass with a thank you, but my fingers were ice. Her tone was syrupy, but her eyes, they darted, like she was checking if anyone saw her. I glanced down. The drink shimmered strangely under the chandelier's light, barely visible, but something floated on the surface. That's when I made the quietest decision I've ever made. Without missing a beat, I turned toward her husband, Douglas, the one who constantly reminded me I wasn't a provider, and said, "Hey, Doug, cheers." I handed him the glass and took a sip of my untouched water instead. He raised his to mine with a grunt and drank. 45 minutes later, he was pale and sweating, stumbling toward the guest bathroom as retching echoed through the halls. Loretta's smile vanished. She looked at me. I looked right back. She knew. And now, so did I. If you're still here listening to this story unfold, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to remember. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's just the beginning of a much bigger reckoning. The chaos started quietly. Douglas excused himself, but by the time the door clicked shut behind him, the sound of violent retching filled the house. Plates clattered as guests exchanged uneasy glances. Loretta went pale, her fork hovering midair. Across the table, I met her eyes. She looked cornered, not panicked, too controlled for that, but rattled, like a performance slipping off its hinges. I didn't say a word. Just sipped my water and watched the woman who had called me temporary for years realize I wasn't nearly as passive as she thought. Haley, my wife, rushed to help her father. I stayed behind, letting the tension pool in the silence. Loretta began muttering something about bad oysters and shellfish allergy, but nobody had eaten seafood. She knew that. We all knew that. I quietly reached for the untouched glass, my original drink, and slid it into my coat pocket. No drama, no scene, just quiet calculation. And beneath the tight collar of my shirt, something shifted in me. It wasn't rage. It was colder than that. Clean. I wasn't going to scream or make accusations. I was going to unravel them, piece by piece. Haley and I met 7 years ago during a local art walk in Burlington. One of my nature portraits, an owl mid-flight in the snow, caught her eye. She lingered, asked questions, then stayed longer than she planned. We talked about light, conservation, purpose. She was finishing her master's in environmental science. I was barely paying rent with wedding gigs and freelance shoots. But somehow, it worked. She saw me, not the bank balance, not the borrowed car or secondhand gear, but me. Her parents never did. From the first dinner at their lakeside house, I felt it. Douglas sized me up like a bad investment. Loretta smiled too tightly and introduced me as the photographer friend. Every Sunday dinner felt like a job interview I hadn't applied for. They'd ask about retirement plans, health insurance, how long I planned to chase this thing. Sometimes Haley would squeeze my hand under the table, a quiet apology. I tried for her, brought expensive wine, showed them magazines I'd been featured in, talked about clients, but their eyes never softened. To them, photography wasn't a career. It was an indulgence, a phase their daughter would outgrow. And for a while, I believed that time might shift their opinions. But after what happened at that dinner, I stopped believing and started paying closer attention. That Sunday night, after the guests had gone and Loretta was still fussing over Douglas's bad reaction, I slipped out to the garage and pulled out my old contact list. One name stood out: Noah Feldman, a former client, now head technician at a private toxicology lab near Middlebury. When I showed up the next morning with the sealed glass, he didn't ask many questions. Just gave me that look professionals give when something's wrong but too personal to touch. "Personal or professional?" he finally asked. "Family," I said quietly. He nodded once. "I'll call you in a few days." Back at home, I couldn't sit still. Haley thought I was distracted from the jet lag. I let her believe that. I wasn't ready to explain, not yet. I needed truth before I brought fire into our home. 3 days later, Noah called. "There were benzodiazepines in that drink, Ethan. Not a fatal dose, but enough to knock someone out for hours. Possibly cause short-term memory loss." My breath left me. "You're sure?" "I ran it twice," he said. "What the hell happened?" I didn't answer. I just asked for a printed report and thanked him. That night, I lay awake beside Haley, the report hidden in my drawer. I watched her sleep, breathing softly, unaware that the people she trusted most had nearly turned her life upside down. I wasn't sure what came next, but I knew this wasn't over. In the days that followed, I kept my distance from Loretta and Douglas. Haley noticed, of course. I told her I was preparing for an upcoming gallery submission. Technically true, but not the whole truth. I needed more than a lab report. I needed to understand what kind of person could do something like that and still set the dinner table like nothing had happened. So I started digging. Public records, pharmacy logs, online whispers from community boards. It didn't take long. Loretta had active prescriptions for Xanax from not one, but 3 different doctors. Some overlapping, some filled early. The math was disturbing. And there were stories, quiet ones. A neighbor mentioned Loretta once accused a guest of stealing jewelry at a garden party. At the country club, someone had filed a complaint about erratic behavior and possible medication abuse. Her family must have buried it, paid it off, smoothed it over. Reputation came before everything else in their world. I wasn't surprised by what I found, but I was furious that none of it had come to light until now. She'd been spiraling for years, and instead of getting help, they masked it with privilege, with denial. And now they'd let that dysfunction bleed into my marriage, into my life. But they weren't going to bury this. Not this time. The moment came sooner than I expected. Haley mentioned, almost offhand, that her mother needed updated photos for a new professional profile. "She specifically asked if you take them," she said, brow furrowed with surprise. "Are you okay with that?" I smiled. "Sure." Saturday morning, I arrived at their house alone. Camera bag in one hand, a sealed envelope in the other. Loretta greeted me in a crisp cream blazer, every hair in place, like it was a magazine shoot. "Douglas is out golfing," she said smoothly. "We have the place to ourselves." Perfect. I didn't waste time. Before setting up lights or lenses, I handed her the envelope. She frowned, opened it. Inside was the toxicology report, a copy of her overlapping prescriptions, a brief summary of the interactions I'd uncovered in the neighborhood. Her hands trembled. "This is absurd," she whispered, her voice tightening. "I would never." "We both know what you did," I interrupted calmly. Her expression hardened, the facade slipping. "You're not good enough for Haley. You never have been. A man should offer stability, not snapshots." "And drugging me provides stability?" I asked, voice level. Her lips curled. "It wasn't meant to hurt you. Just to sideline you. Make you miss your little gallery event. Show Haley you're inconsistent." I let that hang between us. "Here's what happens next," I said. "You tell Douglas the truth. Then you both start treating me with respect. Not because you've changed, but because the alternative is Haley finding out exactly who you really are." She laughed, but there was no confidence behind it. "You think she'll believe you over us?" I didn't flinch. She'll believe the lab report, and the records, and the neighbors. I turned and walked out. I hadn't come to take portraits. I'd come to expose one. That night, Haley sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her messages, frowning. My mom called. She said you were cold, hostile. She sounded shaken. I didn't respond right away. She looked up. What happened during the shoot? I could have lied, but I was done playing quiet. So I reached for the drawer and handed her the lab report, the prescription records, the texts her mother had sent me over the years, so polished on the surface, so sharp between the lines. Her eyes scanned the pages, lips parting slightly. My mother wouldn't do this, she whispered. But there was no strength in the words. I didn't say yes, she would. I didn't say she already did. I let the silence speak. She read for a long time, then set everything down, hands shaking just slightly. The next day, she went to her parents' house alone. She came back after dark, her face streaked with tears. I waited. They said you're trying to drive a wedge between us, she murmured, dropping her bag by the door. That you feel threatened. Because you don't make enough money. Because you're not like them. I nodded slowly. What do you think? I asked. But she didn't answer. She just walked past me and into the bedroom. And that was somehow worse than shouting, worse than doubt, because silence like that, it's where things begin to break. 2 weeks passed. Haley barely spoke to me, and when she did, her voice carried a weight I couldn't lift. She started spending more time at her parents' house, came home with red-rimmed eyes. I didn't press her. I knew their game, doubt, manipulation, guilt. I just hadn't expected it to work so well. I buried myself in my studio, editing, working, waiting. And then, one afternoon, a package arrived. No return address, just my name in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single USB drive and a yellow sticky note. You need to see this. Vanessa, Haley's sister-in-law. I plugged it in, heart pounding. What loaded wasn't just security footage. It was clarity. Loretta, in the kitchen, pouring something from a small vial into a single glass. My glass. Me entering, her quick switch. My hand grabbing both drinks. Gerald sipping the one she'd prepared. And then, after we left, more footage. Loretta screaming at Douglas, "You drank the wrong one." Him yelling back, "This isn't the first time, Loretta." I watched it again, and again, until my hands were trembling and my chest ached, not from shock but recognition. This wasn't some isolated act of cruelty. It was a pattern, and she wasn't working alone. I called Vanessa the moment I finished watching. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was quiet, tired. I figured you'd call. Why did you send this to me? I asked. A pause, then. Because I know what they're doing. And I couldn't stay silent anymore. She told me the truth. They'd done it to her, too. The constant criticisms, the subtle exclusion, the manipulation that started the moment she married Haley's brother, Owen. For years, Loretta had whispered doubts, stirred fights, questioned her intentions, told Owen she was unstable, that she was only after their money. It nearly broke us, Vanessa admitted. I thought I was going crazy. Why didn't you warn us? I tried, she said softly. But Owen wouldn't listen. He still doesn't. He believes everything they say. And if I push too hard, I lose him. Her voice cracked on the last word. I didn't blame her. I understood what it felt like to be alone in the middle of someone else's war, fighting battles you never started, being painted as the enemy for simply not surrendering. But now I had proof, and I wasn't going to let them keep doing this. Not to Haley, not to anyone else. The spell they cast for years was breaking, and I intended to finish the job. The next day, I got a text from Douglas. We should talk, man to man, no wives. I met him at his golf club. Private room, thick carpets, old bourbon. He poured 2 glasses. Families are complicated, he began smoothly. Loretta can be protective, but her heart's in the right place. I didn't touch my drink. Drugging someone isn't protective, I said flatly. He waved it off like a misunderstanding. Loretta's on medication. She probably mixed up the glasses. I have the footage, I said. His smile vanished, replaced by something colder, calculating. What do you want? He asked. Money? Is that what this is really about? I always knew you married Haley for status. I leaned forward. I want you to stop. No more lies, no more manipulation, no more undermining our marriage. He laughed, low and bitter. You think you're the first? We've dealt with your type before. Haley always comes home. Then he said something that froze me. Ask her about Thomas, the fiancé before you. My stomach turned. What are you talking about? Nice kid. Doctor, we didn't like his family. Took 6 months, but she broke it off. Cried in her room for a week. History repeats, son. On the drive home, my mind reeled. This wasn't new. This was practiced. And it had worked before. But not this time. I called Bethany, Haley's old college roommate, that same night. She answered sleepily. But when I asked about Thomas, her tone sharpened. Oh, God, that was awful. He was everything her parents claimed to want. Smart, kind, successful. But Loretta didn't approve of his family, and Douglas said Thomas was too soft. They planted doubts, made vague comments about infidelity, suggested she check his phone. One day, she found messages that looked suspicious. Planted, Bethany always believed. By then, Haley didn't trust him anymore. They broke her down, piece by piece. Sound familiar? I didn't tell Haley, not yet. Instead, I started reaching out to people from her past who had mysteriously drifted away. A few old boyfriends, childhood friends she no longer mentioned. The pattern emerged quickly. Anyone who encouraged her independence, anyone who didn't fall in line, was slowly erased from her life. Sometimes with whispers, sometimes with lies. And every time, her parents stood back like nothing had happened, as if they hadn't orchestrated it. Vanessa sent me more footage. Quiet conversations between Douglas and Loretta, casually discussing how to guide Haley after our divorce, how to bring her back, how to rebuild her path. It wasn't just control, it was obsession. They weren't afraid of losing her love. They were terrified of losing her obedience. He showed up on a Tuesday. No call, no warning. Just a quiet knock on the studio door as rain tapped softly against the windows. I opened it to find a man in his late 30s, tailored coat soaked through, eyes cautious but steady. Thomas, he said. Thomas Langford. I think you know who I am. I did. Haley had only mentioned him twice, always carefully, always briefly. Her past before me was sacred ground I never tried to dig up. But here he was, in the flesh, looking like a man who'd held something in for far too long. I heard about Loretta and Douglas, about the footage. I shouldn't be here, but can we talk? I let him in. He didn't sit at first, just paced slowly through the gallery space, pausing in front of a black and white photo of 2 deer beneath snowfall. Then he turned to me. They destroyed us, he said quietly. Your wife and I, we were engaged. It wasn't perfect, but we loved each other. He sat then, hands clasped tightly in his lap. They told her I was cheating, planted messages on my phone. Someone called her from a blocked number claiming they'd seen me with another woman at a hotel. I was out of town that week, alone, for a conference. But by the time I got back, she wouldn't even look at me. His voice cracked at the edge. I tried to explain. She blocked me, and just like that, it was over. He reached into his coat pocket and handed me a folded page. An old email thread, print faded, but legible. Haley, confused. Thomas, desperate. Loretta copied in, subtly fanning the flames under the guise of concern. They don't just interfere, he said. They orchestrate. I nodded slowly. They almost broke us too. Almost. He stood again, smoothing his jacket. I don't want to make things harder for her. I just thought, maybe you should know. I do, I said. Thank you for showing up anyway. Thomas paused at the door, then turned. She was different when she was with me. Softer, open. I think she still is under it all. Just don't let them take that from her. Then he was gone. I stood in the quiet for a long time after, the weight of someone else's heartbreak settling into the walls around me. They'd done this before, but this time, they wouldn't win. I knew showing Haley bits and pieces wasn't enough. She needed to see all of it. So I gathered everything. Lab results, video clips, prescription records, emails from her mother, messages from the people her parents had driven out. I organized it onto a single drive. Then I invited Owen and Vanessa to dinner. I didn't tell Haley why. We ate quietly. Haley was guarded, Owen made small talk, Vanessa watched me closely. Then, over dessert, I plugged my laptop into the TV. There's something you both need to see. The room fell silent as the footage played. Loretta in the kitchen, slipping something into a glass. Douglas yelling, "This isn't the first time." Footage of them conspiring, manipulating, planning a wedge, emails, patterns, their entire playbook laid bare. Haley didn't speak, just watched, pale, still. Owen muttered under his breath, "This isn't real. That's not my parents." When it ended, Haley turned to me, her eyes wet. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I looked at her, steady. "Because I needed you to see it for yourself. Not just what they did to me, but what they've been doing to you. Your entire life." Owen stood, hands shaking. "You edited these. You must have." Vanessa touched his arm. "They did it to us too. Why do you think they only accepted me after we had James? A grandchild gave them leverage." Owen didn't argue. He just sat down, silent, broken. Later that night, Haley crawled into bed beside me. She didn't say much, just lay there, staring at the ceiling, her fingers brushing mine like she was checking if I was still real. "I need time," she whispered, barely audible. "But I believe you, and I'm sorry I doubted." I nodded, not needing more. The next morning, her phone rang. "Loretta." She put it on speaker. "Darling," her mother chirped, "I've been thinking. Why don't you come stay with us for a little while? Just you. Marriage can be overwhelming. A little space gives clarity." Haley's voice was steady. "Mom, I've seen the videos." Silence. Then a brittle laugh. "What videos?" "The ones where you drugged Ethan's drink. The ones where you and Dad planned to break us apart." Another pause. "Sweetheart, whatever he showed you, he twisted it. You know Ethan has always been jealous of our family." "Stop," Haley said sharply. "We're coming over tonight, all of us. Me, Ethan, Owen, Vanessa. We're going to talk face to face. No more games. No more lies." She ended the call without waiting for a response. Then she looked at me, really looked. "They're going to deny everything," she said. "I know. They're going to turn it around on you." I nodded. "So what's our plan?" For the first time in weeks, I felt steady again. "They wanted a family meeting," I said quietly. "Let's give them one they'll never forget." That evening, we arrived at Loretta and Douglas's house just after sunset. I carried my camera gear, not to capture portraits, but to document truth. Vanessa and Owen were already there, seated stiffly in the living room. Douglas greeted us with a practiced smile. "Let's not turn this into something dramatic," he said. "There's clearly been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," I replied, setting up my tripod. "I'm recording this for the family archive." Loretta's voice rose, shrill and immediate. "This is private family business." "Exactly," I said. "And I'm family, even though you've worked hard to make sure I never felt like it." For the next 2 hours, we laid it all out. The toxicology report, the video footage, the audio files, the manipulation, the patterns. Douglas denied it all. Loretta accused me of editing everything, said I was mentally unstable. But with each lie, I played another clip, another message, another memory they couldn't refute. Eventually, Haley stood. I love you both. You're my parents. But what you've done is unforgivable. You don't get to control my life anymore. Owen followed, voice shaking. We're not children. You don't get to choose our partners, our paths. You've crossed a line. Loretta began crying, not from regret, but from the slow realization that control was slipping. Douglas looked at me. Finally, no more arrogance. Just something that almost resembled respect. And for the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider in that room. I felt like the one holding the mirror. Before we left that night, I handed Douglas a small envelope. He opened it cautiously. Inside was a USB drive. It has everything, I said. The footage, the reports, the testimonies. It's yours to keep. He narrowed his eyes. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm not going to ruin your reputation. That would hurt Haley, and I won't do that. But if either of you ever try to interfere in our marriage again, if you speak against me or try to control her, I'll make sure every member of your club, your board, and your social circle sees the truth. Douglas didn't respond immediately, but something in his posture shifted. For once, he wasn't in control. I underestimated you, he muttered. I met his gaze. Yes, you did. 6 months passed. Haley and Owen started therapy. Boundaries were set, and surprisingly, respected. Loretta and Douglas kept their distance. Occasionally, they'd send a polite message. Nothing more. Then, near Christmas, we received an invitation. A fresh start, it read. We went. Dinner was quiet. Loretta made a show of civility. Douglas asked about my work with what felt like genuine interest. After dessert, he pulled me aside into his study. I have a proposition, he said. A junior partner track, at my firm, substantial salary. I looked at the scotch in my hand, then back at him. Why? Because you've proven yourself. You protected my daughter. That's what a real man does. I set the drink down. I'm not for sale, Douglas. And neither is Haley. I left Douglas's study without another word. Back in the dining room, Loretta was showing Haley old photo albums, smiling versions of the past that had never quite matched the present. Haley caught my eye. I gave a subtle nod. She stood up, voice calm but certain. Mom, Dad, I have something to share. They looked up, expectant. We're having a baby. I'm 3 months pregnant. The air in the room changed. Loretta gasped, tears springing instantly. Oh, darling. Douglas moved slower, gaze flicking between us, searching for the angle. Congratulations, he said stiffly. Thank you, I replied, then leaned closer, my voice low enough for only him to hear. This child will never be a pawn in your games. I promise you that. His face didn't change, but the silence said he understood. 3 weeks later, a certified letter arrived from his lawyer. Inside, the deed to the home we'd been renting, and legal documents for a trust fund in our child's name. No letter, no apology, no terms, just signatures. Haley didn't ask why, and I didn't question the motive, because I knew this wasn't about remorse. It was acknowledgement, the closest thing to surrender a man like Douglas could offer, and it was enough.